Hi, everyone.
Hello there. In our 3 previous segments on Babylon the Great, we have noted the fact that there are 6 mentions of Babylon in the book. We've covered 3 of them now. This is the first, back in 14 verse 8. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality." Well, there's not much there to identify what Babylon is. The second reference, though, is more helpful. That's 16, the famous passage about Armageddon, starting in that verse, verses 16 through the end of the chapter 21.
Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne, saying, "It is done." Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since man has been on the earth. So tremendous was the quake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup.
Of the wine of the fury of his wrath, this mine says.
Yeah, I just can't read very well there. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones of about 100 pounds each fell upon men. And they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible.
So in our second video, we alluded to the fact that this great earthquake, obviously, is not something that's happened yet. An earthquake so great that the great city falls, or split, and the cities of the earth fall at the same time. This is in the 7th bowl, the very last judgments of God before the second coming. So, again, though, the descriptives, this great city, cities of the nations, and then Babylon is mentioned. So, again, we have the allusions to the fact that this is a city we're talking about, and this is, of course, sealed by the fact that in 17, the first long description we have of Babylon, you have description of a woman that's sitting on 7 hills. Clue number 1, that it's the city of Rome. Sitting on a beast, and we've identified the beast, most commentaries have as the emperor, and also sitting on waters. So how can all these 3 pictures be true at the same time? Well, if they're symbolic, they can be. But then you have the symbols explained, and we've spent a lot of time on that in the first video. Verses 15 to 18, they'll culminate the argument from chapter 17.
Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth."
So again, we don't have to speculate. The explanation is given.
Yeah.
This city sits upon many waters, which are explained to be peoples. So we have the empire mentioned in verse 15, the city already before that, and now explicitly the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. There's no other city that had dominion over the kings of the earth that the people who heard this in the 1st century would know about. In fact, there was no city in the world. And for a long time that remained the case. That's why the 4th empire, the Roman Empire, lasted so long. And we made the case in the 3rd video that there's a like phenomenon in the book of Revelation, that just as Rome is never mentioned by name, only by this description, so Jerusalem is never mentioned by name, except in the New Jerusalem at the very end of the book, thousands of years in the future, from the standpoint of here. But if you ask, well, why would the emperor turn on his own city? Well, there was a precedent for that. The rumor had already gone around in the 1st century that Nero, the 6th emperor, had burned the city. Now, whether that's true or false, it was a rumor that everybody knew about. And there was another superstition that Nero's going to come back again.
Verse 17 says God has put it into their hearts.
Yeah.
So God's controlling factor here too.
So they would know of a precedent for this, and that Nero was called the incendiary, and he was supposed to come back again and finish off the job he was doing, destroying his own empire.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, even if we didn't have that information, we would have the information that God put it in the hearts to do his will.
So what I see here prominently is city, peoples, kings.
No explicit references to religion.
No.
Now we get to 18. This is where the other three references to Babylon occur. So let's read the first 10 verses this time, and next time we'll deal with the rest of the chapter.
After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth commit adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay back double for what she has done. Mix her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn.' Therefore in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, 'Woe, woe, O great city, O Babylon, city of power. In 1 hour your doom has come.'"
So what's your general impression when you read just these 10 verses?
Well, I remember when I was a witness, you were always told this was the church.
False religion.
Or false religion, but there's no comments about worship or religious things, idolatry, which has always been a problem in the past with believers, and so you would think it would be mentioned if that was the problem. But it's all about more economic stuff, so it's talking about kings and merchants and excess, luxury. This doesn't sound like religion overall. It sounds like economics, like political power, economic power, to me.
Yeah, the references in verse 3 to her immorality. Well, you think if you're a witness that relates to religious stuff. And sometimes it does in the Old Testament, but not here. And if you look at the source documents for this description, and they are Isaiah 46 and 47, where you have Babylon, and she actually says in Isaiah, "I sit a queen and am no widow." The very same words.
Oh, yeah.
And of course she was an idolatrous power, and the idolatry is mentioned. The gods are mentioned in that original passage, as they are in Jeremiah 50-51, another key source for this and the previous description. And the main source, though, seems to be Ezekiel 26-28, Tyre, which you don't think has that much prominence. Politically, it didn't have that much prominence, but economically, it was the greatest power in the world when Ezekiel wrote around 600 BC. So most of the description here relates closer to Tyre than it does to Babylon. But again, economic power, political power, military power, yes.
Are not empires oftentimes described as women
Yeah.
as well?
So I sit a queen and am no widow and never shall see mourning. But her plagues will come in a single day. And there I'm reminded of the fact that the overturning of the original Babylon in Daniel's day was a sudden event. But God had foretold it. And so in the original case, get out of her, my people, meant literally leave the city of Babylon. That they didn't have the chance to do that before she was overtaken, apparently, because of the suddenness of Cyrus's conquest. Yeah. But they did afterwards. But most of them did not. They were already set up. And remember that passage in Jeremiah where Jeremiah says, settle down in Babylon.
Because you're going to be there a long time, 70 years.
So you can get comfortable in Babylon.
Yeah.
But the 70-year exile was now over at the end of Daniel, and they were to come out.
They were called back
And
once the time was over. They were temporarily they were going to be in one place.
But apparently they loved Babylon more than they loved Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So they stayed.
So this all reminds me, too, of, so how do we apply get out of her? And if it's a city, I think it brings to mind the Gorman commentary, where he talks a lot about remembering that you are supposed to be counterculture. This is written to the church to encourage them to stay following the Lamb and be counterculture. Don't get too settled in to earthly things, because you're supposed to be a temporary resident here. So that's like Hebrews 11, right? You're temporarily here, but think in terms of eternal things, not earthly things.
Yeah, we're supposed to think of our earthly life as a pilgrimage, according to Hebrews, right?
Yeah.
And he's also writing to people who are attached to a system and a city, Jerusalem. People who can't think of God working outside of that city context. So we have a parallel there too, that Rome looked invincible. So what were Christians to do who lived there? And there were apparently thousands of Christians who lived in Rome in the vicinity. Certainly in the empire, you couldn't escape the empire.
Yeah.
But what were you to do? You were to be no part of the world. You were to be in the world, but not of it.
Right.
So I'm thinking too of the parallel in verse 18:5 rather. For his sins have heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered our iniquities. So there, it seems to be an allusion to the ambition of the original Babylon, when Nimrod built her.
Babel,
Act of defiance against God, and explicit defiance of his original purpose. But again, Babel in Genesis 10 and 11 is not a religious empire, primarily. It has religion, like all peoples do, but it's a power.
For a city.
A power in defiance of God. A building of a tower in the heavens, a city, and then an empire. Nimrod's not satisfied just to have a city. So he goes about building the first empire. So the sins heaped high as heaven reminds me of that passage, and I think it would have reminded the early believers.
And if you're talking about sins, crimes, you do think of a lot of the downfall of empires is because of those things, because they have gotten vicious, and done terrible things to people, oppressed them.
Revelation talks about those who live on the earth, and it doesn't seem to be just an allusion to the fact we all live on the earth, but we don't have to live in the world. Those whose citizenship is in the heavens, as Paul in Hebrews puts it, right? That's where our commitment should be. So again, verse 10, the climax. Alas, alas, the merchants say. This is an argument the Watchtower uses against the other interpretation that we're alluding to here. They say, well, it can't be merchants, it can't be economic power, because the merchants survive. But the city doesn't survive. You great city, alas, alas, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. So this is not the gradual fall of the Roman Empire. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire, as Gibbon famously called it. This is a sudden destruction of the city itself. So we'll put in a link to the first of the series, in case you haven't seen it, on Babylon the Great, on chapter 17. And also to the Daniel playlist, because those Jews in Daniel's day had the same dilemma that all Christians have. Those Christians back then living in the Roman Empire, or the city of Rome, and we today who live in the midst of empire, now worldwide. The dilemma they had was, do we stay in Babylon and make our home, comfortable home in Babylon, as those Jews did back in the days of Daniel? Most of them stayed there because they were now economically comfortable.
Yeah.
Or do we take
They
a risk
settled
and go back and rebuild God's temple? And unfortunately, most of the believers back then compromised and stayed in Babylon, even if they remained Jews. We don't know exactly how many remained Jews, but the diaspora stayed scattered. Most Jews liked the places they were living in, and most Jews then lived outside the Promised Land. And so we'll put in a link to the Daniel playlist, where we look at Daniel's situation and how he made the most of it and remained loyal to his God even when he had to live in the city of Babylon with his fellow remnant.